Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. A few weeks ago, the Ontario Liberal Party had its big annual convention, and things look good. They had a huge turnout, a lot of excitement, and a lot of press. And so I wanted to check in with someone that I know, Andrew Perez, who I've interviewed before. He's a senior consultant with Hill Knowlton. He's been involved in the Liberal Party for quite a time. He was part of the war room from a communication standpoint during the last election. He's a freelance author. He's a media personality, and he's a really nice guy. We've been trying to get together, but he fit in a trip to Mexico before he could come back on the show to talk a little bit about the AGM. And I guess the question really is there a future for the Ontario Liberal Party? You know, they're down to, as I think someone on the other side of the aisle calls, could fit in a minibus. And this convention, they had a bunch of different issues that were pretty important that they issued. And then Andrew, I want to chat because in addition, this last week, a budget came out from the Ford government, and a lot of the press was this is a Kathleen Wynne government. And so is there room for the Ontario Liberal Party? Can it survive, and is there room? So let's go through a bunch of these issues. Andrew, first of all, talk to me a little bit about the annual general meeting and momentum coming out of it. What do you think?
Sure. Thanks, Brian. It's so great to be on your show again. I was there in person. It was a 3-day conference. It was the largest non-leadership convention gathering of the party in more than 20 years. So it really was significant. There were over 1,700 grassroots Liberals there. Having been there for 3 days, I can say that, and I think the press, the media coverage reflected this. The mood was buoyant. The mood was uplifting. I think there is a sense that this government, 5 years into its time in office, is vulnerable. And I think, at a very high level, at a broad level, I remain convinced that Liberals in Ontario remain the alternative. I think, we have different political cultures in different provinces in this country. And unfortunately, in many provinces, there really is no Liberal Party. And so the alternative is often the New Democrats. We see that in Alberta right now with Rachel Notley, who is hoping to regain power. But in Ontario, for a variety of reasons, and I think it's partially the ghost of Bob Rae, Liberals are seen as the alternative to Conservatives. And so I think there is hope for this party if we make a number of very important reforms. And I'll just say briefly, the first one that we made, internal party reform at this conference, was adopting a weighted one-member, one-vote leadership election model, which essentially allows every single party member to have a say in voting for the next leader. We, until 3 weeks ago, had a delegated leadership model convention, which, to my knowledge, I have yet to confirm this, but to my knowledge, we were the only mainstream party left in the entire country that still had the delegated model. And it's just, there are some advantages to it, but overall, it's not a very democratic means in which to elect a leader. So I'm thrilled that we overwhelmingly adopted that. And I think that's the first piece of the puzzle in terms of rebuilding our party.
So you say that the Liberal Party is the alternative. The NDP has been the official opposition for the last two elections. Why do you think the NDP can't be that? You mentioned Bob Rae, but Bob Rae is a Liberal now and was the leader of the Liberal Party. So he may have been an NDP premier, but that was a long time ago.
For sure, and I should add add the caveat. We have to be very cautious, and we can't be. We can't take our voters for granted. The NDP have a new leader, Marit Stiles, who I think is an authentic individual who certainly has some appeal. And so, yes, to your point, there is a risk there. I think the broader point, though, is I think for me, the political culture in Ontario, with the exception of the Bob Rae interlude from 1990 to 95, we have been a two-party system in terms of competing for power. And so I haven't seen anything in the last 5 or 6 years that would change that. I think, look, we have been devastated by 2 back-to-back, defeats where we weren't even able to secure party status. So I think that's extremely serious, and that's why we're talking about this today. But I think fundamentally, and you've probably seen this with some of the polling lately, Doug Ford's Conservatives remain well out in front, but the Ontario Liberal Party is in second place. And we were actually able to eke out a second place finish in popular vote last June. I think we won about 10 or 15,000 more votes than the NDP, which is a very small margin of victory. But it's important to point that out because the NDP clobbered us by seat count, and they are the official opposition. But I always like to remind Ontarians that we essentially tied and we actually beat them in popular vote. That's clearly not reflected in our seat count. We have 8 seats. We don't have party status, and that has so many implications for us. Because we're not a party, we don't benefit from resources. Queen's Park, there essentially is no leader's office at Queen's Park. We have an interim leader, John Fraser, who's very capable, but he's relying on staff as an MPP to serve him. And then our 8 MPPs, each have several critic roles, and just MPP staff to support them in their research and in their communications. Whereas the NDP with 40 seats has a leader's office with communications and operations and policy and issues management staff. And in terms of securing media coverage, that's really important. So I think we are behind the 8 ball on that front. And we can get into, from a broader perspective, what the party has to do. I think right now, obviously, we're going to be going into a leadership race within the next 6 weeks to 2 months. I think we will be fully in a leadership race with candidates launching their campaigns. We already have a very good sense of who will run, and we can get into that. I'm actually supporting one candidate. So I think that will be the focus of the party. And the debates right now are, what will the timeline be for this leadership race? Will it wrap up in late 2023 or will it go into 2024? Can the party afford to not have a permanent leader for such a long period of time as we look ahead to the 2026 election? That's a decision that's going to be made by the new executive council, which is essentially the board of directors of the party. And we elected a new executive council in Hamilton 3 weeks ago. So that new executive council, as we speak, is looking at the rules. What will the entry fee be to enter the leadership contest? What will the timeline be? And I'm expecting those details to be announced within the coming weeks.
But bottom line, you believe that the Liberal Party of Ontario is not dead and has a good chance to win the next election?
Absolutely not dead. I'm absolutely hopeful for the next election. I think our strategy needs to be a combination of, yes, playing to win the next election, but also first and foremost playing to rebuild the party. So if that involves making tough decisions and putting resources in ridings that we probably won't win in 2026, I'm actually a strong advocate for that. So as opposed to putting all our resources into the GTA, Greater Toronto, Hamilton area, Ottawa, with hopes of cobbling together, 55 seats to eke out a majority with zero representation in rural Ontario and small town Ontario, I'm actually not an advocate for that because I don't think that's a durable winning strategy. That's how Kathleen Wynne won in 2014. She was able to win like a super majority within the greater Golden Horseshoe. We actually picked up ridings in unexpected places like Cambridge and Durham that were previously held by the Conservatives, even throughout McGuinty's time in government. But we had almost no representation in rural and small town. And we saw, that was a one-term government. Now, there were many other factors around being in power for so long that led to our defeat. But I think the durable election strategy is to, yes, obviously build on Toronto and Ottawa, but then also have, a number of seats in rural and small town. So those voices can be reflected in our caucus and our cabinet, so that we're not seen as purely an urban party, which is how we're seen right now. And I can't say that that's inaccurate.
We're chatting tonight with Andrew Perez about the Ontario Liberal Party, its recent convention, upcoming leadership convention, leadership contest, and whether there's a future for the Liberal Party in the political spectrum in Ontario. Stay with us, everyone. We'll be back in just 2 minutes. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. We're talking tonight about politics in Ontario. Our guest is Andrew Perez, who is a senior consultant with Hill & Knowlton. He's a media personality. He's an author. He's written a bunch of columns and op-eds, and he's a long-time Liberal activist. He was in the war room for the Liberal Party during the last election. Andrew, you talk about popular vote, that the Ontario Liberal Party actually got higher popular vote, I remind you that the Conservatives got higher popular vote than the Liberals in federal elections, both of the last two times, and both Andrew Scheer and Aaron O'Toole were quickly deposed because even though the popular vote is nice to brag about, it's not what the game is in politics, and so it doesn't really count. And you're right. It's astounding that the Liberal Party got higher popular vote than the NDP and got what, 1/6 the number of seats. It's one of the strange things about our political system. This last budget that the Ford government came out with, numerous members of the media called a Kathleen Wynne type budget, and it would appear that the Ford government really is governing from the center. And if it's Kathleen budget, it's from the left of center. The NDP seems to be not very left wing. It seems to be crowding the Liberals in the center. And you compare that, at least I compare that to federal politics, where some people would say Pierre Poilievre and the Conservative Party have moved to the right, and Justin Trudeau and the Liberal Party, particularly given its effective coalition with the NDP, have moved to the left. And so you've got the parties in federal government sort of going to the extremes, and the parties in the provincial situation moving to the center. So I come back to my first question: is there room in this situation, in this political spectrum, for the Liberal Party of Ontario?
I think it's a really good question, Brian, and like to really underline what we're seeing, the difference between in the federal arena, where we are seeing that polarization, and in the provincial arena, where we seem to see kind of a bunching around the center. And I think that's what, and I've heard this said, and I agree 110%. I think that's 5 years out from our 2018 defeat. I think we're still stumped as a party as to how we deal with, and some Liberals will not like me saying this, a moderately center-right Conservative government and a fairly moderate NDP. I think the Liberal Party, as a historically centrist party, has done well, has won big when we've been able to own the center. And that's been authentic, and we saw that with Dalton McGuinty, who was the leader of the opposition at the tail end of the Harris era. Objectively a right wing, Reagan-esque government, and was able to own the center and really put forward, a vision of strong social progress within a broader economic framework. And we saw Ontarians buy into that, and he won three back-to-back majorities. And with the Chrétien government, we saw the same thing, facing quite a right-wing official opposition with the Reform and Canadian Alliance parties. But that's not the case in 2023 in Ontario, and I think that's a central challenge. I do think there's room, and I would take issue slightly with the premise of your question. I've said it many times. I agree. Ford is not a traditional Conservative. He didn't come from the Conservative Party. He brought his Ford Nation base to the leadership of the party and surrounded himself with party veterans to kind of put together his cabinet and advise him. But his base was his own base from municipal politics. His father, who was a local MPP, the Ford family had a very strong base and popularity in Etobicoke. And so I think that's what makes this situation unique. And I think he governs as what I would say like a centrist populist. And he's certainly not averse to spending government money on infrastructure. In fact, that was his campaign motto, was get it done. And it was actually brilliant because people have remarked that was the one thing coming out of the election that they remembered: their children or their friends or family members who spend zero time following politics. They remember Doug Ford is about getting it done. He's about building highways. He's about building infrastructure. And they couldn't tell you what the Liberal platform or Liberal offering was about, because it was a grab bag of a million different issues that didn't necessarily have a cohesive theme. And so I recognize that. Having said that, I guess the issue where I take a bit premise with your question is, this is not a Liberal government. We're seeing what they're doing on healthcare in terms of privatizing. Look, I support private delivery of public medicine. I'm pragmatic on that front, but I'm concerned with what I'm seeing in the healthcare debate. What I'm seeing on the Greenbelt and what they've proposed there really concerns me. I think that's an issue that the majority of Ontarians would have grave concerns about. And some of the ethical lapses that we saw reported extensively a few weeks ago around the Stag and Doe, the wedding reception that Doug Ford had, where there were developers at that reception who have actually benefited from MZOs, Minister of Zoning orders, that have fast-tracked developments in the greater Golden Horseshoe, and who would stand to benefit directly from changes to the Greenbelt. And so I think this government is vulnerable. I think that when it comes to public services, I'm skeptical as a liberal as to what if their heart's really in these commitments. I think liberals would do a better job of investing in healthcare and education. So to answer your question, I think there is a space. I think it's more challenging because this is not a Mike Harris or a Pierre Poilievre type leader that we're facing. This is someone that's more pragmatic and that, as we saw, can appeal to blue-collar workers, can appeal to people who traditionally wouldn't see themselves as conservatives. So that's what makes it tougher. But I think they are vulnerable on public education, public healthcare. And I think with the right leader and with the right platform, in 2026, this government will be nearing a decade in power. I'm pretty optimistic about from a baseline, without knowing who the leader is yet and how we're going to position ourselves. At a broad level, I'm optimistic about our chances.
So I agree with you that they're vulnerable, but I do think that they've crowded out the Liberal Party from a political spectrum, because I do think this budget particularly, and who knows whether they implement it all, but the budget was a very centrist, if not a Kathleen Wynne type budget. It was certainly not a Mike Harris common sense revolution kind of budget. And I don't think it would be, I don't think it'd survive in Pierre Poilievre's Conservative Party federally. And so I think that is smart. I do think that some of the things they're doing on housing are some of the smartest things that have been recommended on housing in forever, frankly, and I do think that affordability or lack thereof is a huge issue with a lot of young people that realize that they just can't ever afford a house or a condominium unless it's like 400 square feet in Toronto, if not, frankly, the whole Greater Toronto area. So I think some of the things they're doing on housing make a ton of sense, but it's also that the NDP aren't very left wing right now. They're not out there. Like a Corbyn or even a Ray, they're pretty centrist too, and so the Liberal Party is being crowded on both sides. Anyway, let's go on to another topic. There was this open letter to Mike Shiner of the Green Party that was trying to recruit him to leave the Green Party and lead the Liberal Party. I guess a merger of the two parties. What did you think of that, and did that make any sense?
I was quite public on social media on my opposition to it. I had a number of issues with it. At the end of the day, to me, it was a Hail Mary pass. I respect many of the names on that list. These are longtime veterans, former elected officials, a deputy premier, a finance minister, and I respect those individuals and their service to the party. But I think the notion that we would go look for the leader of another party to lead our party is seriously flawed. First of all, and I've pointed this out on social media, look, I think everybody respects and admires Mike Schreiner. He's a bright guy. He's a principled man. He was widely seen to have won the leaders' debate last June, although that didn't really do him much good. But if you look, if I was to give him a report card, he's been leader of the Green Party, and I think most people don't realize this, since 2009. So in a 14-year period, he's managed to get himself elected. Nobody else. He has a caucus of one, and I think he was elected in 2018. So it took him 9 years to get a seat. He has no fellow caucus members. He's edged up the popular vote very modestly. And so I think if you were assessing Mike Schreiner as the leader of the Green Party over a 14-year period, I don't think he would get an A. Look, I think it's challenging for Green parties to win seats. They're seen as, they're not seen as a mainstream party. But I look at some of the success that Elizabeth May had on the federal scene. So why they thought that bringing him, I guess, to lead the Liberal Party, I guess the thinking was that we would be able to take advantage of his persona and his personal popularity. That the thinking must have been, there's a lot of Ontarians who like and respect the guy, but won't vote for him because they're not aligned with the Green Party. Having said that, I think because where we sit as a party, devastated with election losses, lacking a grassroots base, it was a real insult to the grassroots, to me and many other people who remain involved in the party. And also it was very offensive to the 3 or 4 candidates who are seriously exploring leadership bids. We have 3 or 4 candidates who are liberals, who have actually very strong CVs and compelling stories that will be running for this leadership race. And I think we need to look at them and we need to support them. And I've come out in support of MPP Ted Hsu, who will be running for the leadership. He's been seriously exploring a bid for the past few months, and I can speak about why I've decided to support him. But there's other strong candidates like Nate Erskine-Smith, a federal MP, Yasser Naqvi. We know that other caucus members like Stephanie Bowman, who was a successful banker who sat on the board of the Bank of Canada, is contemplating a run. She's the member for Don Valley West. Dr. Adil Shamji, who is a doctor, obviously, and a new member of provincial parliament, is looking at a potential run. And we continue to hear speculation that Bonnie Crombie, mayor of Mississauga, or even Navdeep Bains, who is the former industry minister federally, is kicking the tires. So we have a lot of liberals who are known in the party, might not be household names more broadly, but are certainly known in the party, that are seriously contemplating runs. And so that's why I just think that the Schreiner letter didn't make sense. And we saw that Schreiner took a few weeks to consider his options and ultimately decided that, this isn't something he was going to pursue. And I think that's for the best. And I think we turn the page. And it's been asked, did this hurt the party? I think it was such a short little episode that I don't think it will hurt the party. I don't think it has lasting power. I think it didn't pass the smell test for most Ontarians. And lastly, I just say, floor crossing is nothing new. People, members of parliament, MPPs will cross the floor, will run in a by-election. It's unprecedented to have a party seek out the leader of another party. And it just, as I said, it doesn't pass the smell test. And it remains to be seen whether Schreiner would have been a more compelling leader than any of the others that we're looking at.
I do think your comment about sort of leader persona is critical, though, and I think that was one of the reasons why. And maybe this is addressed by the one member, one vote, delegated, non-delegated election that you're going to have for the leadership. I do think that you had some pretty capable people running in the last Ontario Liberal leadership campaign, and yet no one really captured the imagination of the Ontario populace. And the convention was won by Stephen Del Duca on the first ballot, which would have suggested he should have had this huge amount of grassroots support and a leadership persona, as you called it, and yet he didn't, and he didn't resonate with people almost at all. I think that the vast majority of people today would not be able to say what he stood for, other than maybe a Bucka Fair Transit, which was the one issue that I sort of remember, like Bucka Beer from the Conservatives a while ago. So do you think that this change in the way that you're going to elect leaders is actually going to make a difference?
I do. And I think it's important to place a bit of context around the leadership victory of Mr. Del Duca. I think, for your listeners, we were coming out of that devastating loss in summer of 2018, and then we had a leadership race. And the party, the party was shocked to go from 15 years in power. I think we had about 55 or 57 seat majority government to 7 seats. And I think a lot of the people that you might have thought might have run for the leadership didn't. And so, the 3 top candidates were Del Duca, Michael Coteau, and Kate Graham. And I think there was a sense within the party that that Del Duca had been preparing the groundwork for the leadership for years, and from an operations point of view, had it locked up. And what I mean by that is he had been traveling to every riding association for months prior to that. Essentially, as soon as we lost the June 2018 election, Del Duca was on the hustings, traveling the province, to his credit, like building support, grassroots support in riding associations across the province, months before the official leadership race kicked off. And so when we got into that official leadership race campaign, which we're about to now again, he had a huge lead, and Michael Coteau and Mitzi Hunter and Kate Graham, I don't ever think really stood a chance from an operations point of view. I agree with you. I think Del Duca was not a compelling speaker. He had spent his entire career in politics. He didn't have outside experiences. He wasn't able to relate. But I almost think that the party apparatus and the party grassroots, maybe even, were almost resigned to the fact that he was going to win. And so, as you saw, he won that leadership easily, delegated model. And I know that he maintains that he would have still won that leadership under a one member, one vote. So I'm not sure one member, one vote would have changed the result 3 years ago. But why I make this point is I think it's important to set the context that coming out of 2018, the party was devastated. We weren't able to necessarily attract top level candidates to run for our leadership. And Del Duca filled that void. He saw that void and he started organizing months before the official campaign. And I think at that point, he had it in the bag. This time, I think it's very different. I don't see of the candidates so far that look to be running an instant front runner. I think Nate Erskine-Smith has certainly done an excellent job of establishing himself over the past year, like speaking to the media and openly saying, I'm looking to contest the leadership of this party. I see an opportunity. We need to rebuild. And he's had that bandwidth as a backbench MP in Ottawa for the past 8 years. You know, he's never held a cabinet post, a parliamentary secretary role. He is a backbencher, somewhat of a renegade. That's how he's built his name as an MP who's willing to, vote against the party line. He has his own podcast, which very interestingly, he interviews MPs, opposition MPs, Aaron O'Toole, Michelle Rempel-Garner. So he's a very unique MP. I think for him, the challenge is how do you segue between being a maverick, being an independent-minded MP who's been on the backbench for 8 years, to then becoming a party leader who is leading a party and wants to form a government and put forward a platform. That, for me, will be a challenge for him. But I don't, my point is, I don't think there's any instant front runner. So I think this is going to be a robust campaign. And I think it's going to be good for the party to have leadership debates. We're going to get media. I mean, once we get past the Toronto by-election on June 26th, I think there's going to be more interest from the media in covering this. And just finally, I'd add, it's in, and I don't want to be partisan about this, but I feel strongly, it's in sharp contrast to the Ontario NDP, who there was no leadership contest in that party. There were a number of MPPs that were apparently interested in contesting the leadership, but they weren't able to cobble together the organization or the entry fee. And so Marit Stiles, who's an MPP, was essentially just acclaimed as leader about 2 months ago. And so I think that was a real missed opportunity for the Ontario NDP. They're the official opposition. They've been so for 5 years. And they had an opportunity coming out of 14 years of Andrea Horwath to have a robust leadership contest, to secure media coverage, to have a debate about I don't think it's clear what the future of that party is. There's different factions within that party. You know, you remark that they're more middle of the road now, but there's different views in that party, and that party, I think, missed an opportunity to have that debate. And maybe Marit Stiles very well would have won that leadership race, but at least she would have gone through a contest. She would have had to she would have had to run that campaign, and I think it would have made her a stronger leader. Instead, she was simply acclaimed as leader. And so I like the contrast between the two opposition parties, even though our party is by far behind the 8 ball when compared to the NDP, we still have more interest in our leadership race. And I think that's exciting.
But leadership races break parties apart. There end up being factions that don't get healed for quite a while. And they take time, and they take money, and they take effort. Isn't the NDP in a better position? They've got their leader, and they don't have a broken party. And the Liberal Party is going to have a big race. There are going to be factions. There's going to be infighting, and it's going to be maybe a year until the leader is in place. And so it's a whole year that the NDP and their new leader have to cement their position in the Ontario population.
So that's the key counterpoint, I think, which I think has some merit for sure. But I think, all things being said, I would rather have, I as someone who's followed politics for a long time, I get concerned when leaders are acclaimed. I was a big supporter of former Prime Minister Paul Martin. But we saw in 2003, I mean, I guess he wasn't officially acclaimed, as Sheila Copps ran as well, but it was a fait accompli, and he didn't actually face a vigorous leadership contest. And had he, and I think his own advisors and loyalists would agree, he would have been a stronger candidate. He came in and all of a sudden, I think was not quite prepared for what awaited him. And so I think any leader, any rookie leader, is made stronger by running in a leadership race. Now, that's the question now. I think we do need to have a timeline that's reasonable. I would like to see our leader in place by late this year. So that is to say, I'd like to see a leadership race held by November or December.
Okay, well, why don't we take a break for some messages and come back and talk about timing, because that is the big next issue. Stay with us, everyone. We're talking about the Ontario Liberal Party. Is it dead? Is it alive? Does it have a future? And how and when should they elect a leader? Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. Our topic tonight is the Ontario Liberal Party. Some people may say, who's the Ontario Liberal Party? Because it's sort of been absent in the last little while, though it did have quite a long tenure with Dalton McGuinty and Kathleen Wynne in majority territory. And in the last two elections, has lost official party status and doesn't even exist as a party in the Ontario legislature today. Our guest is Andrew Perez, who's a senior consultant with Hill & Knowlton Strategies. He's also an activist Liberal. He's been very involved in writing and in media commentating, and it's a real pleasure to have him back with us today. Andrew, we were talking about timing, and there's some people that think that the strategy is best to get the leadership contest done right away, such that you can get a leader that can take 3 years to build their stature within the Ontario political spectrum. And then other people think, no, particularly given that you're not official party status and you can't really, fund a leader's office and a leader himself or herself, then what you do is you end up having, a real problem with attracting really good candidates. And the right thing to do would be to wait a couple of years, or if not at least a year, and then elect it. And then closer to the next election, you're going to get the strongest potential candidate. And one of the examples people use is Doug Ford, who only became leader. What was it? A month or something like that.
Yes.
Before the provincial election in his first run, and because of his public persona, because of his brand awareness, he triumphed big time at that time. And so therefore, leaders don't need to get elected 4 years or 3 years prior to an election to be successful.
So this is a really interesting question. And as a bit of a political history buff, I can give a couple examples. So I was recently on Bill Kelly's radio program on CHML, and he's an advocate of a quick leadership race. He thinks that, as you said, Marit Stiles is in place. The Ontario Liberals need a leader right away. We need to build that name recognition. And he cited the 2006 federal Liberal leadership that Stéphane Dion won. So a couple of points there. So that was an extremely long leadership race. It started in about March 2006, and the vote was like December 1st or 2nd. So that was the better part of a year. Now, the context there is the Liberals were coming out of just being defeated after 13 years in power. So I think that long runway was necessary. However, we were in a minority parliament under Harper. And Bill Kelly noted, and we ended up with Stéphane Dion. Look how that turned out. I don't think the length of the leadership race was the problem there. I think, ultimately we selected a leader that wasn't able to resonate. And so I think we have to just be careful about what lessons we take from leaderships past. And the Doug Ford one you cited was—
Okay, hold on. Let's talk about that just for a second, because I think it's interesting. I think the lesson from that was the mistake of the delegated convention. And that the deals that can be made. And I think that the problem was the deal between Gerard Kennedy and Stéphane Dion, that one would go to the other, and the Kennedy forces never dreamt that they'd be in fourth place, and that they would have to go to Stéphane Dion, and then at the same time that there was such division between the Ignatieff and Ray factions, who were for a long period of time in first and second place, And so therefore they could never dream of getting together. That split was so profound because they were the deemed frontrunners for such a long period of time. And if you had a one member, one vote, weighted or not weighted, I wonder whether Ignatieff or Ray would have been the winner. And I think that would have been the more logical conclusion. It was only the delegated convention that allowed this sort of chess match to work. And so I think that's really one of the proofs of the benefit of the one member, one vote. The counter to that argument, and if you're the historian, maybe you can tell me this, Dalton McGuinty won his leadership, and I think he was in like fourth place.
He was, and that was the delegated convention model, and it was actually there were a lot of parallels between that one and the one Dalton and the one Stéphane Dion won, because they were both in fourth place. Well, I guess Dion would have been in third place, but they were both in third or fourth place on the first ballot, and they were both seen as candidates that couldn't win. But they were also both seen as compromise candidates that no camp was really offended by. And in fact, a little fun historical detail, on the second ballot in 1996 at Maple Leaf Gardens, McGuinty actually lost votes. Like his vote, like he continued to be in fourth place, but he actually got less votes. So he was like, even his camp were like, okay, this is not going our direction. And then on subsequent ballots, there was movement on the delegated. Other candidates came to him, and he had momentum. And he even said in his own words, like, in a delegated convention, the most prized asset you can have is momentum. And Kathleen had that. Kathleen Wynne had that in 2013 when candidates started moving to her, and then you create that sense of inevitability. But long story short, my point to Bill Kelly is I don't think it was the runway. I don't think it was the duration of that leadership campaign in 2006. That wasn't the problem. I think the party probably strategically wanted a long leadership race to gain media coverage coming out of their defeat from government. Now, look, the Ontario Liberal Party provincially, 8 seats, cannot hope to get the media coverage that a federal leadership race would have been able to get, what is now 15, 16 years ago, when we had a different media landscape, people consume newspapers. So we're in a different era now for a number of reasons, but still, I think there is media coverage that a party can get in a leadership race. It's a competitive, the media like to cover competitive stories where there's a race, there's a horse race. But long story short, my view is that we need a balance. So we need a fair and equitable leadership race that allows as many candidates to enter as possible. But we also need a timeline that's reasonable. I don't think we should be getting into selecting our leader well into 2024. I think a key lesson from the last election cycle was that Stephen Del Duca, he won the leadership the day, basically 1 week before the world shut down. And so then his entire leadership was during COVID-19, like that of Aaron O'Toole, actually, on the federal scene. And that really handicapped both leaders. And then the other challenge Del Duca had is he really only had less than 2 years to prepare for the election. And so the way I see it, if we have our leader in place by late 2023, we will still have 2.5 years runway. And I think that's the critical point here is we are in a majority government. So there's no risk of an election. We have essentially set election dates in Ontario. The next election will be May or June 2026. So if we have that leader in place by late 2023, we have 2024, 2025, and about half of 2026. Now, I'm not suggesting that 2.5 years is a ton of time. In my conversations and interviews with party grassroots and party brass, I increasingly understand that preparing an election campaign is, a 4-year role. Like, the work starts the day after the election. To nominate 124 candidates is a Herculean task from I don't think even everyday Ontarians understand the administration and operations work that goes into vetting and running. Like, you're essentially running 124. Well, I guess incumbents would be protected, but for we only have 8 incumbents. So we're essentially running 116 local nomination races. And who runs those? The party runs those, relatively junior, not highly paid staff, the executive council. And so from an operations point of view, there's a ton of work. So I'm not saying that 2.5 years is a lot of time, but I'm hoping that it would be sufficient. And my number one concern and priority as a member of the party is that we get it right. Let's not rush the leadership race. Like, let's have a race that encourages as many people to get in, that allows for those debates. I want to see debates, in-person debates in different regions of the province. And so I think 7 or 8 months timeline is probably the soft spot there. And then hopefully we select the right leader and we go from there. So I don't want to rush it, but I also don't want a process that's really going too much into 2024, because then we're just getting too close to 2026. And there's just too much, not only operations work, but also communications. Dwight Duncan said it best. None of these people who are going to run for our leader are household names. They're going to have to grow into the role like David Peterson did, who was not known, who had thick-rimmed glasses, that wasn't a known entity. Dalton McGuinty, who was seen as wooden, and the media wrote him off, that he had no shot. And I think our next leader is going to have a similar challenge. They're going to have to grow into the role, mold into the role, and handshake by handshake, interview by interview, kind of cement their presence across this province.
So I'll give you a counterpoint or a counter argument. I think the American primary system works really well. And, you have people declare their candidacy in the year before the election, but the primaries really don't get started until the winter of the year that the election is held.
Right.
The election's in November. The campaigns get started in January, February. So, 10, 11 months prior. And what ends up happening there, I think, is that you end up getting really high caliber, high quality candidates running, because it's an intensive year. It's a year, and most of it is known, fairly certain. You winnow down the race fairly quickly through that primary season. I worry that the longer it is between the election and the leadership campaign, you either get people that have already got a job as MPP, and so therefore they can afford to be the leader, or you get people that frankly, shouldn't be running because they don't have a lot of alternative great jobs. And if you've got a really good alternative great job and you're doing good things and you're contributing to society, etc., why do you want to give it up for 3 years to work in a leadership office that is a leadership office of a party that's not even an official party and may not even be able to give you a stipend, let alone a salary? Yep. So I would suggest that if you have the election in late 24 or even 25, the average caliber of the candidates that are going to run is far higher than if you have it in 23 or early 24.
That's an interesting point. I hadn't really, because to my mind, that would be far too late in the election. Like, I think I take your point. You would attract perhaps higher caliber people who would have the time to organize. Like, because right now the three main names are all elected officials within the party. They're not household names by any means, but they're well known within the party. It sounds like you're suggesting holding the leadership race a year or two later would allow maybe a prominent business leader or a prominent nonprofit leader or someone who,
or a federal cabinet minister, yeah, or someone like that. I think that if you had the leadership campaign in the fall of 25, which would be terrible given your scenario, but if you had it in the fall of 25 and the election was in the spring of 26, I think that you would get really good candidates, because they're saying this isn't a 3-year commitment. This is a 1-year commitment.
Yeah, but so I would say it's not a 3-year commitment. It's a 10 to 15-year commitment. It's a commitment to run in 2026 and
a commitment before you can get elected.
Right.
You're right that you may not be elected as premier, you may be elected as leader of the official opposition, which would be probably an incredibly good target to have, get official party status and get official opposition status, and have the leader have elected in their own riding, which would be unique and wonderful too.
I think the problem there is that it would be to my mind, logistically impossible to prepare for an election in May of 2026 if the leader was only in place that fall.
Why? Ford was elected a month before.
And I think that's the exception to the rule. And actually, I wanted to get into that. That was such a unique situation where you had Patrick Brown who suddenly had to step down, and you had a scheduled election for like June 2nd or 3rd of that spring. And so the PC party was essentially in a crisis situation because I believe Brown stepped down in late January. So suddenly, 4 months before an election, the official opposition that was seen to be well positioned to win, Brown, every public opinion poll showed Brown was going to win. All of a sudden, you had no leader. So they called that leadership race, and they had to, by necessity, have a very short timeline. And I think Ford won that in March of 2018. And then he had essentially April. He had 6 weeks as leader, and then the writ was dropped. So that is, I think that was by absolute necessity. And I think your argument is, but it worked.
But it worked. And Ford was, I think, a high caliber candidate. And the proof is that he's won 2 majority
but my point would be,
and he would not have been, I think, a candidate if he had to hang around for 3 years.
I'm just not sure that can be replicated. I think he won. Part of the reason he won the election is he was facing a 15-year incumbent government that was severely unpopular.
No question. But I think that could be the case in a couple of years. Anyway, I think it's going to be a good debate. Let me turn to one more topic before we lose you. There's a couple by-elections coming up. How does that play into the whole scenario?
So I think it's interesting. Obviously, we won't have a permanent leader in place when these by-elections are taking place. We had a by-election take place 2 weeks ago in Hamilton Centre. The NDP carried that seat. That was former leader Andrea Horwath's seat. She held it since 2005. Prior to that, it actually was a Liberal seat. But that's become such a table stakes riding for the NDP that our party really didn't have a shot there. We did improve our popular vote by a few percentage points, and so I was pleased to see that. But that remains quite a difficult seat for us to gain. So we will be having Mitzi Hunter, who is MPP in Scarborough, has indicated that she'll be running for mayor. So there will be a by-election in her Scarborough riding in the near term. So that will be one by-election. And just on Friday, Mayor Lee Fullerton, a minister in the Ford cabinet, announced that she was stepping down immediately, both as a minister and as the member of provincial parliament. I believe the riding is Canada-Carleton. So there will be at least 2 more by-elections within the coming months. There's also some speculation that Christian Wong Tam, who's a MPP in Toronto Centre, where I live and am right now, might be contesting the Toronto mayoralty. So there could potentially be a by-election in Toronto Centre. So look, I think by-elections are an opportunity for the party to test its messaging, to, obviously look to improve, in some of these seats, I think obviously Hamilton, Canada-Carleton, I looked at the vote tally there. Essentially, the PCs won it by over 8,000 votes 8 months ago. So I think there is potential there. The NDP and the Liberals were essentially tied for second. That, I think, will be a tough riding for us to pick up this time. But I think it's an opportunity to improve our vote share significantly and position ourselves to take back that riding in 2026. That I would say that's a more or less a swing riding that probably favors the progressive conservatives a bit, suburban Ottawa, but it's a riding that we've held in the past, and it's a riding that I believe we hold federally. So it's a riding that we should be aiming to retake. Maybe not in this by-election, but certainly in a future election. And certainly Scarborough is a riding that we should hold. Interestingly, I think the Toronto mayoralty is having implications on provincial politics. Nate Erskine-Smith, who will be running for the leadership, he said that he wants to enter the Ontario legislature at the earliest available opportunity, and his Beaches East York riding is geographically quite close to Scarborough. So I'm just thinking aloud here, would he contest that by-election? then that would have federal implications because he's also a federal member of parliament. And he can't run in his seat provincially because that's held by rookie MPP Mary Margaret McMahon. So it's interesting when you have a Toronto election, which then has implications provincially. But to answer your question, I think these by-elections are an opportunity for our party to assert itself, to attract good candidates, to test out our messaging, and to, even if we don't win the riding, like really improve our vote share and prepare the groundwork for 2026.
Andrew Perez, thanks so much for joining us and chatting about the Ontario Liberal Party. I'll give you my 2 cents. I think that governments, have a time period. They don't last forever, and whether it's in 3 years that Ford will be defeated or the election after that, the Conservatives will have a certain time period in government, but it's not going to go on forever. And so therefore, it is time to start thinking about who's going to be the party and the leader and the policies they're going to take over after that government. And so I think that the Ontario Liberal Party is not dead, has a great future, and I agree with you that it probably has a better future than the NDP, because I think the NDP does have a cap in Ontario politics, and it's probably a cap comparable to where it currently is in popular vote. The Ontario Liberal Party doesn't have that same cap, can go up by another 10 or 15 points in popularity, and the Conservative Party similarly has a cap, probably comparable to where it is in the low 40s or high 30s now, and probably will never go much below, where the NDP is right now in the low 30s or high 20s, and so it's got a minimum. So the Conservative Party will always be there, the Liberal Party will always be there, the NDP will always be there, but the only ones that have got a real opportunity to grow is primarily the Liberal Party, but then also the Conservative Party when there's a split on the left. So I think that it's time to start thinking about that. I do think that the longer you can delay the leadership convention, the leadership contest, the better, higher quality candidates will come about. I do agree that there is a challenge in regards to organizing, but I think if it's a high quality candidate, you don't end up needing that extra time. And Ford's an example, Trudeau's an example, the US primary system is an example, and Stephen Del Duca had a long time. And you're right that it was during COVID, but he had a long time, and I think he never was able to create an image in the Ontario population. And I could go back and use some other examples in that regard. And Dion Ignatieff would be, I think, other examples federally of that. And so therefore, long time isn't the solution. High quality candidates is the solution. And so therefore, the objective should be, or the question should be, how do I ensure I get the highest caliber, highest quality candidates to run, and the most active, competitive contest of both ideas as well as organizations. Anyway, that's my 2 cents. Andrew Perez, thanks for joining us. That's our show for tonight. I remind you, everyone, I'm on every Monday through Friday at 6 o'clock on 960 AM. You can stream me online at saga960am.ca, and all my podcasts and videos are on briancrombie.com. Thanks, Andrew.
Thank you.